Welcome to Litpoetry, the podcast where we go on a journey of discovery, reading, analyzing, and discussing great poetry from around the world. Poetry is worth it because the reading and writing of poetry is a revolutionary act that has the potential to transform both the reader and our world.
Welcome to the Litpoetry Podcast Season 1. My name is James Laidler, Australian poet, writer and your host. In today's episode we'll be pulling up our doonas, drifting off into a gentle slumber and dreaming of a world that could be. This is a strange land of sedate monsters, earthy relationships and the unfolding of slow, joyous time. Welcome to the imagination of Australian poet Nathan Curnow and his poem Epic. Now, Nathan has agreed to join us here on the Litpoetry Podcast today, so a few introductory words are in order. Nathan has been writing and performing poetry for over 20 years, winning numerous poetry awards. His words have been projected onto buildings, performed on stage, inscribed on park benches, turned into song and visual art, and published in beautiful books. His collections include No Other Life But This, The Ghost Poetry Project, Radar, The Right Wrong Notes, and the Apocalypse Awards. He has taught creative writing at Federation University and continues to conduct workshops and speak at events about writing and the writing life. As a spoken word performer, he has played gigs across Australia and around the world. But before I introduce you to the poet himself, let's take a listen to the poem that will be at the centre of our discussion today. May I present to you the poem Epic by Nathan Curnow. Epic by Nathan Curnow. There came upon the land a time of great rest. It's not the usual beginning, but hear me out. The prince finally accepted his arranged marriage, and the dragon flew back to the mountain. People were happy, going about their lives. Some were rich, some were good at mending. If a stranger came knocking late one night, they were welcomed. That's all that happened. It's called peace. But little is written about it. The prince slowly fell in love with his wife. The dragon remained sleeping inside its cave, the smell of carving seasoned in its nostrils. It went on and on. Nobody lost their lives fighting battles that didn't make sense. Instead, there was a family with a pet pig. They brought it inside and sang it songs. It sat beside the fire listening every night with a dumb, bacon grin on its face, one that suggested it liked harmonies. So they kept it, though it looked delicious. It's an epic tale full of loyalty and love that's ignored because it lacks events. But there's glory and joy, simple, ongoing joy, as in heaven, which is mostly eventless. And if conflict stems from a fear of death, boring tales might somehow release us. Peaceful stories beginning here on earth, that with the telling will come to pass. So welcome, Nathan, to the podcast. It's great having you as one of our guests. And yeah, how you going?
Good. Thanks for having me, James.
No worries. So Nathan, we might just kick things off with just giving our audience a little bit of an insight into you as a poet and about what the trajectory of your poetical life has actually been, the challenges, the successes, the inspirations, the motivations, that type of thing. Yeah, over to you.
Yeah. I started off pretty young. When I say young, I was 24, and I had 3 kids under 3. So I wanted to make a big splash, and I had a lot of expectations about poetry and success, and I really wanted to be known as a writer. That was really important to me. I really wanted to make money for the kids. I don't know why I chose poetry, but I thought I would be brazen and hardworking enough to succeed in doing that. Looking back, it's a crazy idea. Yeah, I had some early success there, and I received some grants and got some opportunities that, really set me on the course of a writing life. I've received lots of recognition and awards, and, I've been really, really lucky. So now the kids are grown up and moving out, and I'm still writing, and there's my dog. I don't know if you can hear her. Yeah, so, there have been challenges along with that. There's been a lot of shifting of the goalposts, and those expectations really were so strong that I had to readjust those, and that came with a lot of grief, and a lot of that early recognition was great at the start and is what I needed, but I also had to negotiate that later on, and it became a problem. So, you win some big awards, and you wonder what it means, and you start trying to write to win more, and all of those traps that a writer can get stuck down. I've pretty much found myself in all of them.
Yeah, so I imagine
hopefully,
it's quite a sort of rabbit warren to sort of head down as a writer. Yeah. So,
and it's a very isolated game. So you are in your head a lot. So, there are the traps of that, and of waking the monsters, which I think it's Harold Bloom says, writers wake the monsters, and you do a fair bit of that as a writer.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because, and there's always this tension, I think, in writing, and when you're thinking about the purpose of writing, sort of, we get sucked into the vortex of our own identity and our egos and all that sort of stuff, and then balancing that out with what I imagine would be much more nobler purposes and orientations. So can you talk a little bit about that tension, how your years of writing have been? Maybe I assume there's been a bit of a struggle between those tensions too.
Yeah. Look, one of the big trends, I think, of the last few years is probably art therapy and writing for health and, for health of individuals and communities and all of that stuff. I've never really been interested in that. My ego has been wrapped up in it in a big way. And that's okay, I think. It probably produces some great stuff. I don't know. But that's always, been my thing to balance and to negotiate. I don't know what else I can say about it. You'd have to have a pretty healthy ego if you went into poetry, I think.
I think
you'd have to be mad.
But what's really interesting, Nathan, is that you're also acknowledging and talking about poetry from a fairly humble and honest perspective about that has been a challenge too. So, that's interesting. And when do you think when did that become a sort of pretty tangible an awareness in you?
Look, that's a good question. I think it still is, James. It depends what day you catch me on.
Oh, right. Yeah.
It's a long journey. You still, I think, grieve at times, and you think, why am I doing this? I can't do this anymore.
Yep.
Although, to be honest, those days are are not what they used to be. Like I do sense I've broken through to a certain degree, and I'm happy where I am writing with less expectation. So look, it's not as bad as it used to be, and part of that I think is having some secure employment on the side where I'm earning a wage for the family, and it's not all kind of writing driven.
Yep.
That does mentally, help.
Yeah, so that's right. In the small population that we have in Australia, being a novelist or a writer is hard enough, but being a poet that can actually live off the proceeds of poetry. In fact, I don't really know of any poets who have really managed to do that. Well, there's probably a handful, perhaps, but yeah. I think the recognition side of things too is, I can recognise that I've done a lot of cool stuff. And I've been very, very lucky, and I don't ask any more of that anymore. I've found an audience, and I've been able to receive a lot of privileges. So I think I feel established, and I feel like I'm happy where I am finally. Yeah, good. Do you find that you've come to that sort of place in yourself? Does that allow you has that changed your focus in poetry? Like, has it shifted the type and mood of the poetry that you're writing now? Like, how does your poetry that you write now differ from the poetry as a young man, do you think? Like, is there some sort of difference?
Yeah, I think there is. It's certainly changed my practice. When I was starting out, like, if you want to succeed at anything, it has to be the last thing you think of when you go to sleep and the first thing you think of when you wake up. Like, you need to be devoted. So yeah, it's not that anymore. It's changed my practice. I don't have to write something every day. I can relax and not be afraid that the talent is going to dry up, or that the next poem isn't going to come. I don't have to worry about that. I'm just a lot more comfortable knowing it'll come, and I don't need to put that pressure on myself.
Yeah.
So it's changed my practice. I'm probably slower than I used to be. In terms of the types of poetry I'm putting out, I'm just writing whatever I enjoy writing. So yeah, I'm not thinking about style or how it's going to cohesively fit in an end product down the track. I am just writing poem by poem for my own enjoyment, and that's the part of the process I love the most. As good as it is to have a book out or to perform, I don't enjoy those things and all that comes with them as much as when I'm in the poem, writing it, crafting it, feeling it.
That's a very interesting thing, isn't it? And I can probably really relate to that. It's kind of the ironic thing about poetry and writing and creative pursuits. And I was talking to an artist friend recently about this, that the most fertile, joyous moment is that work of creation, when something new is on the edge of coming to life. But then when you sort of take a step back and you become aware of yourself, that's when your ego kicks in. That's when you start thinking about, well, what are other people going to think, and what this, and and just it kind of almost pollutes what you've done in a way. It's a very strange dynamic, I think, at play.
It is, and I love it. It is almost that place where you lose yourself. It's that balance of directing the poem and using your brain, and also kind of half shutting it off at the same time, and just feeling and listening and being open. Sitting in that balance in the middle of the construction it's a high. It's just wonderful. It's the heart of creation, and you get to be in that zone and experience life and yourself in another way.
Yeah, time slows down, and it's an amazing. It is amazing. It's like a natural drug, I suppose, in a way.
It's the zone, and the experience is just enticing. It's also very hard.
Yes.
Every time I'm in the middle of a poem, I'm like kicking myself. Oh, damn it. Why are these things so hard?
Yeah.
But I love that challenge, and Yeah, I love being in it still, even though I'm kind of cursing it.
Yeah, no, good. We might take a quick break here, and then we'll come back and we'll focus on the poem that we've listened to, and we'll try to unpack that a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, welcome back to the Litpoetry Podcast. We're talking here with Australian poet Nathan Curnow about his life and work as a poet, and in particular about the poem we listened to earlier called Epic. And I suppose that's where it got to and what we want to talk about. So I think it's a really fascinating poem, and I approached Nathan to commission one of his poems and turn it into a sort of like a music video type of thing. So this video of the poem is live as we speak. And I would love to ask Nathan about what's that like when somebody approaches you and says, can I do something with one of your poems? And then maybe you could talk to us a little bit about what that process was like. And there was a couple of challenges in that process as well, which you might want to talk about.
Well, firstly, it's lovely that anyone's showing interest in the work. So it's very nice, and you want an audience for the work, so it's great. Also, there's some trepidation. I've been involved in, collaborations or things like this that I wish I wasn't, and you don't want the work butchered. Just used, actually. It probably used more than anything. Used in the wrong way for the wrong purposes. You want it to be genuine, whatever that means. So, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this. We had a couple of drafts, and we got there in the end, I think.
Yeah, we did. We had some serious hiccups along the way. In fact, to give a bit of backstory to the audience. So originally, when I received 5 poems from Nathan, and then I isolated this particular poem as one, I thought, this really has a strong sort of motif that I can sort of sink my teeth into. And in my mind, I was really going, this is a real fairy tale sort of motif that's undergirding the poem. And I hadn't done anything like that before at Litpoetry. And I approached my UK voiceover artists who I go to for some things, and I gave him instructions to read it like you would read it to a very young kid in bed as a fairy tale, to make them excited and that sort of thing, to give it that sort of element. And the version that I sent back to Nathan, I'm not sure what. I mean, you should be honest and tell us actually what was going on in your mind at that stage, like whether you actually did pitch me in like an apron with a butcher's cleaver, sort of hacking away at your poem.
No.
Yeah. So,
look, I was very honest with my my feedback, and you were very gracious in that you took that feedback. So I've had the endings of plays changed on me. I've had, nothing is new to me. And I know that you're learning too, and I have to learn actually that my voice and the way I read things is not the be all and end all. So there's just some coming together that we needed to do, and I think we did. It is a very accessible poem. It is, and I think it's accessible to all ages. And I can totally see how you went down the fairy tale thing, because that is what it's buying into, isn't it? They're the tropes in the poem. But I do have this kind of interest in what it is to present a poem genuinely, and the kind of paradox in that, and how to get out of the way of the words. And
yes, and which
as a performer, I think it's really interesting how you let the words do their job. And it's going back to ego too, isn't it? Because obviously you're needed to deliver the words. Like, you can't get out of the way of them completely because you're delivering them. But it's this strange balance.
It is. In the second version, I read it myself, but it's a really, I know the times I've been really impressed with poetry, recital and that sort of thing is usually when the poet seems to really inhabit the words. I think that's a really good way of putting it. They become so enmeshed and in the words, and it's not about their ego, not that they're throwing their personality and say, look at me, to the audience. They are just in the words, and they're sort of like swimming in them and delighted and letting the words unfold across their consciousness and all that sort of stuff. And it's mesmerizing. I think that's what I tried to bring to the second version, and I started to read it. It was really good being challenged by you, actually, to read it in that way. And I think the poem kind of sort of opened up like a flower to me, and I could see other depths in there by taking on a different mode and a different voice, because the early version was very didactic. It was very, oh my God. Yeah. I mean, I had a sleeping dragon there, and when it was talking about carving season, I had a little cow that came out on the screen. It was crude, I think. But I was playing up to that sort of the Princess Bride sort of idea. I even had some footage from that particular film in there. Might have a quick listen so that the audience can understand how bad the first version was, and then we'll come back.
Okay.
Epic by Nathan Curnow. There came upon the land a time of great rest. It's not the usual beginning, but hear me out. The prince finally accepted his arranged marriage, and the dragon flew back to the mountain. People were happy, going about their lives. Some were rich, some were good at mending. If a stranger came knocking late one night, they were welcomed. That's all that happened. It's called peace, but little is written about it. The prince slowly fell in love with his wife. The dragon remained sleeping inside its cave, the smell of carving season in its nostrils. It went on and on. Nobody lost their lives fighting battles that didn't make sense. Instead, there was a family with a pet pig. They brought it inside and sang its songs. It sat beside the fire, listening every night, with a dumb, bacon grin on its face.
Anyway, we might just end that there, because I don't want to go any further. Nathan, just a little bit more about that particular poem. So I hope that was okay listening to that little snippet.
That's fine. That's fine. I really like your idea about inhabiting the words. That's exactly what it is. And it's that when you're writing it too, when you're in that zone we've been talking about, it's you inhabit the language and what language can do.
Yeah. And I imagine that's with a lot of art, so painting and all sorts. When the artist it loses themselves and almost loses their own sense of self in the process, because there's something universal that they're doing. Moving on about the poem itself, and hopefully our audience can recall the original version. I suppose you mentioned before that allowing the words to really to stand out. Now, of course, with lit poetry and the whole sort of philosophy or impulse behind this project has been, that poetry is lit. So I've taken coined a modern phrase, because my concern is, of course, is trying to bring poetry alive to a world that perhaps where the allure of poetry has dropped off the side of a cliff for a lot of young people in particular, and I teach young people. And so to add elements to poems to allow them to, I suppose, percolate in people, but as an access point with music. So, of course, I'm not sure if that was the part of the process that made you a little bit nervous, because I was going to put music to it. There's also a video, and it can become quite distracting to the words. And I think after talking to you, what I tried to do was really strip it right back, everything back, so that words really did feature.
I love it. I love what you've done.
So with the poem itself, Nathan, there's a couple of things that I want to talk to you about, and by all means, if you want to add your own thoughts, because this is a really interesting poem. To me, the theme of rest becomes really apparent, and of sort of finding a peaceful sense of belonging in our world. There's a real gentleness to the poem, a sense of surrender, and even, strangely enough, perhaps this word compliance, which is often a negatively associated, connotated word. Compliance, like when the prince, sort of accepts his arranged marriage. So what was going on here? What are your thoughts here? I find this really fascinating. And was there anything in particular that was lying at the heart of this sort of sentiment I'm seeming to be picking up on?
Well, this poem began with that first line. Some poems you have a last line, some poems you have an image or a metaphor that kick you off. This was kicked off by an opening line that came to me when I was watching a movie with my kids, and it was a fairy tale movie, and there was that classic opening. There came upon the land a time of great unrest. And I just thought right there and then, what if you switched that up and changed it to rest? And then I just had to follow that thought through and really explore that thought. So I was kind of set on a course from that opening line. And it's about peace. And if you follow that line, you say, well, what if all the stories, the best stories out there, the ones about peace, have never been told? And perhaps they're more important than any of the others that stay with us, about conflict and conquest and all these things that fuel drama, so we're told, and fuel story. So I just began really exploring that. And so, of course, I had to fill out the fairy tale tropes, because that's what the first line suggested. I was really just set on a track, set on a course from that opening line. So I had to have a prince, I had to have a dragon, I had to, have rich people and poor people. Everyone's just happy. And that's fine. That was great. It all kind of wrote itself pretty easily until about halfway. Yeah. And then you realize this poem is about nothing happening. I'm stuck. How much more can I write about nothing happening?
And there is a clear divide in the poem, I think. So it really becomes something else. There's some real philosophical musings, I think, towards the end as well.
The end was the worst part.
So the end says, a heaven which is mostly eventless. And if conflict stems from a fear of death, boring tales might somehow release us. Peaceful stories beginning here on earth, that with the telling will come to pass. So, so can you take us through that particular ending and where your mental space went to?
Oh, that was rough. It was like a month and a half, 2 months of just trying to nail out these last few lines that I just could not get right, and it killed me, James. It was just always in my head. It was an itch I could not scratch. So everything else had written itself pretty well and relatively easily, and then I got to that point, and that was the problem. How could I wrap it up?
So numerous drafts, I imagine, and experimenting with different...
So many different lines, showing them to my partner who wasn't happy, and I wasn't happy. I just wanted it over, James.
So that's tough, Nathan.
It started out as this really nice experience.
That's a really important point, though, because I think we probably have a lot of budding poets, hopefully, listening to the podcast, and it's a really important thing that they hear, that the poetry is partly organic, it's spontaneous, but there are times where the art is also very much a craft, And it's about, isn't it? It's about like really doing the hard yards and struggling. And sometimes you can struggle over one single word even. And multiple renditions. So I actually think that's quite an inspiring thing that you went through that process, and after months you managed to get something that you. So are you happy with the ending, or does it?
Yeah. I think I got there, and you do have to commit to that pain and that agony, because good things can come from it. I think in terms of the idea at the end, we got there in terms of its expression and how it fits with the accessible rest of the poem. I think it fits in. So, I was very happy that I finally got there. So, perhaps if we tell these boring, peaceful stories where nothing happens, perhaps they will actually come to pass. Perhaps they'll make peace happen.
Well, I think it might be a pretty important idea, because, I mean, one of the things that I'm certainly aware of is the increasing importance of narrative in our world and stories, the type of stories, because stories actually build culture, and then that affects our outlook, our ethics, all sorts of things. The foundation of a lot of things in our life are stories. So if you've got a society that is built on the tropes of superhero films and this sort of stuff, and clear sort of polarization between good and evil and that sort of stuff, then those values and stuff will play out in people's minds in the way they live their lives as well, which I think is very fascinating. So from that point of view, I think it is really important. I mean, of course, the stumbling block there, of course, is that you use the word boring tales, and for many people that is a challenge. But to me, this is not a boring poem. But maybe there's that perception that things that are quiet and stripped back and not much happens are boring, but they're not really.
Yeah, I like what you're saying, and that's what poems can do. I think they can open up our imagination. They can awaken us to a potential of what we can be, of what our families, what our communities can be. Poetry does have that power, and that's where poetry comes from itself. It comes from that place of potential, of possibility, and that can take hold in our culture. So, like what you're saying, I agree.
Well, look, just going back to the first part of the poem, I'm quite interested in just talking about a few things, because to me it seems like, and I could be completely misreading that, because I think that's part of the process of when you put something out there, which is quite interesting, that as a poet that you might have had an intention, but then it gets appropriated by other people and interpretation comes into play. So my interpretation, there was levels of it, I suppose, and certainly the first part of the poem I was thinking that there was levels of social commentary, that you were really casting your eyes over society, and you were challenging stereotypical stories, archetypes, and all that sort of thing. And then I was also wondering, then when you're talking about the tropes of dragons and princes, were you reaching for using them in a metaphorical way or as symbols? You got any thoughts in that area, or even possibly, is the dragon, is it social commentary? Is it actually talking about your own self as a poet or something? There was lots of questions I had about what the dragon could symbolise and that type of thing.
Yeah, for me it was very much just I had to fulfil that for the kind of genre or the fantasy theme that I was working with. So to me, the dragon was just a dragon that had to be in the poem. But I have heard people say, the dragon represents nuclear holocaust. And I guess it does represent a metaphorical conflict or threat, or it can do that. But for me, writing it was just very much a dragon. The pig later on is just a pig. And the prince is just, I guess a symbol of someone who is becoming happy, just with life continuing. So, to me, it was just a functional kind of decision.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
So how do you feel? They are all in there.
Yeah. So how do you feel about? So as a teacher, I could take this poem into a classroom, and I would be more than happy to swim in the idea of the dragon for a good 20 minutes, unpacking that with kids, and coming up with all the possibilities of what the dragon could be. Could it be nuclear war? Could it be, and how do you make the dragon that has always got the potential to destroy the fabric of society into how do you make it sleep? How do you, satiate its hungry greed for, calves and that sort of thing? How do you feel about that world of interpretation and poetry?
I think it's fine. I mean, you can do all that. It's like when you're at a gallery. You can't tell someone how close to stand to the portrait. They can be right up to it nose first, or they can be back, taking it out the full range of the painting. It's kind of the same with a poem. You can't tell someone how to interpret it or how deep to get into it for themselves or not. There are no rules there, so people can do what they like. I think there's also, I would have a warning against that though too. At the same time, I think some poems are more open to that than others.
Yeah.
I think Paul Tran, the American poet, talks about the interiority of a poem and how the structure, how the form, how the language use can direct us to the interiority of the poem, to the heart of the poem. And I think if we just want to interpret things however we want, we can miss those clues, and we can miss those. We can miss the heart of the poem. It just becomes about whatever we want it to be. And look, that's okay too. But there is, for some poems at least, an intention of the poet, and we need to be open to that as well. We need to bring what we bring to a poem, but we also need to be open to listening. It's that balance again that we were talking about earlier. I try and find that balance when writing, and I hope readers will try and find that balance when reading, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point about the balance between the two. And then sometimes poems or pieces of literature that have strong intentions, I'd probably sort of push back a little bit and say that, well, you might be reading a poem that really lends itself to looking at it from a Marxist or a feminist perspective. Now, that was clearly, the original author would never intend it that way. But by using those frameworks, there's an explosion of ideas and things that you can read into a poem that weren't intended, but they still reflect the poet and their values lived in a certain historical moment in time. And yeah, that's interesting. But it can go too far, can't it, I think, as well? Yeah,
I totally agree with you. Yeah, those new frameworks can just, bring a new life to the poem, bring a new energy, a new perspective to the poem. I agree.
And look, and that's the exciting thing, because we're not all poets, but when you participate, when you go to an art gallery and look at a painting, and you bring your own views, in some it's a weird thing, but you could argue that you become a co-creator with the artists themselves. Your interpretation is it's another adapted form of art, which is pretty exciting, and maybe that would be an interesting thought that people should hold in their hearts when they're doing this sort of stuff, and it makes it, because it's one thing to write, but we really should be consuming art as well. It's a celebration and moving into other people's work and embracing it where we can.
Yeah, look, the whole author is dead thing. It can be a very empowering thing for a reader to feel like, they are a co-creator, and in probably in every sense they are, because without the reader, there is no work, right? The poem needs the reader to read it, and the reader needs for there to be a poem in the first place. So Yeah, interesting ideas.
And an interesting thing too is that a poem or a piece of literature also reads the person as well. Like, because everything is self-referenced in the end back to our own needs and wants and desires, and it gives us an angle on ourselves.
I don't know if you've had that experience where you read a poem and then 10 years later, and you don't really like it or dig it or get it that much, and then 10 years later you come back to it as a different person, and it really speaks to you. You know, you've had all these experiences, you've had these hurts and these wins and these losses, and all of a sudden, bam, the poem and you go, how does that happen?
Oh, I have. I remember reading Notes from the Underground by Dostoevsky, and I hated it when I read it. I read it in the book club, but the book has bloody haunted me my whole life, and there's something magnificent about it. Some insight into the human condition that's just I can't get past. But
Isn't it interesting? You know, some poems wait for us and need us to be in a certain place, or just open up in a completely different way. It's kind of nice to think perhaps there's no bad poems out there. It all just requires a certain time, certain experiences, a certain kind of living, and then one day it'll all be good.
Yes. Well, there are some bad poems out there that would do well to be redeemed in that way. So anyway, Nathan, it's been fantastic talking to you. Probably we might sign off here. I've actually got to take my young son to work in about 5 minutes. So you're my second guest, and as with my first guest, I wanted to set a tradition. And the question I wanted to put to you is, in your own words, if I asked you why poetry, what would you say?
I didn't really have a choice. Looking back, it I don't want to say it chose me, but look, it really did. It's something about the potential of it that hooked me. That was the writer I had to be. With that Dickinson line, I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose. To me, prose writing didn't cut it anymore. All of that possibility was in poetry. If you wanted to be a real writer, which I wanted to be, to me that could only happen in poetry. That's where the real possibility was. It wasn't just interested in narrative. It was interested in that, but it was interested in the whole potential of words, every word, the richness of every single word and the combinations of those. So that's why.
Great. Well, it's been wonderful having you as a guest, Nathan. And maybe we'll talk sometime in the future. We'll finish with listening to the poem one last time, and we'll be back next week with another Litpoetry Podcast. Thank you, Nathan.
Thanks, James. Great to talk.
Okay. I'll catch you later.
Epic by Nathan Curnow. There came upon the land a time of great rest. It's not the usual beginning, but hear me out. The prince finally accepted his arranged marriage, and the dragon flew back to the mountain. People were happy, going about their lives. Some were rich, some were good at mending. If a stranger came knocking late one night, they were welcomed. That's all that happened. It's called peace, but little is written about it. The prince slowly fell in love with his wife. The dragon remained sleeping inside its cave, the smell of carving seasoned in its nostrils. It went on and on. Nobody lost their lives fighting battles that didn't make sense. Instead, there was a family with a pet pig. They brought it inside and sang its songs. It sat beside the fire, listening every night with a dumb bacon grin on its face, one that suggested it liked harmonies. So they kept it, though it looked delicious. It's an epic tale full of loyalty and love that's ignored because it lacks events. But there's glory and joy, simple, ongoing joy, as in heaven, which is mostly eventless. And if conflict stems from a fear of death, boring tales might somehow release us. Peaceful stories beginning here on earth, that with the telling will come to pass.
You've been listening to the Litpoetry Podcast, presented by James Laidler. For more podcasts, poetry videos, and other useful resources, visit our website at www.litpoetry.com. Thanks for listening.